The soil beneath our feet plays a crucial role in the functionality of almost every ecosystem on the planet, certainly every terrestrial ecosystem. The organisms that inhabit soils consist of a vibrant array of arthropods, annelids, vertebrates, algae, fungi, bacteria, and not to mention plants. Soil itself can be just as diverse. What it's made up of can vary from location to location. However, what they all have in common is in the roles they play for ensuring the successes of both plants and animals, ranging from small, short-lived organisms to the needs of modern-day human societies. But the study of soils is still a relatively new science, and new discoveries are being made all the time. The ways that plants and animals interact with soil can be extremely unique, complex, and demanding. Understanding how soils act as an ecosystem and some of the vital roles they play in the success of above-ground ecosystems is what we'll be exploring in this video. The mineral composition of a soil can be put into three different categories based on their particle sizes: sand, silt, and clay. The percentages of each of these components make up what's known as a soil's texture and gives it its unique characteristics, such as how much water it can hold, how much nutrients it can hold, and what organisms can thrive within the soil. Particle size has a huge influence on the amount of water that can be held within a soil. Smaller particles have a much higher surface area relative to larger ones, and create an environment that favors water holding due to the natural forces of adhesion. Sand is the largest of these particles and has the lowest surface area. These properties allow for water to move more easily through the pore spaces in between particles. However, this also means its ability to hold water is low, as it can be pulled out of the soil through gravity or evaporation. Silt and clay particles are much smaller and have a much greater surface area that water can adhere to more strongly. These particles can also pack together much more tightly and reduces the amount of pore space in the soil, lowering water's movement ability. Particle size also influences the amount of nutrients that can be found within a soil based on the same surface area binding properties that influences water holding. Nutrients such as phosphorus, nitrogen, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are all needed for living organisms' biological processes. However, animals can only get these nutrients from eating plants that have absorbed them from the soil or by eating other animals that eat plants. How the nutrient holding capacity or fertility of a soil is measured is by its cation exchange capacity. Nutrients must be in a specific form in order for plants to use them properly, such as potassium in its 1+ form or calcium in its 2+ form. These positively charged forms of atoms or molecules are called cations, and they are fixed into these forms by a series of biological processes that I will expand on shortly. On top of having a large amount of surface area for these nutrient cations to bind to, clay particles often have a slight negative charge on their surfaces and are a very important factor for the cation exchange capacity of a soil. These negatively charged soil particles become binding sites for the positively charged nutrients to hold onto. The amount of organic matter in the soil also heavily influences its cation exchange capacity, as they too have negative charges on their molecular structures that nutrients can bind to. The pH level in a soil also affects its cation exchange capacity. The more acidic a soil is, the more H+ atoms there are, and these H+ atoms, or hydrogen ions, bind to the negatively charged soil or organic matter particles in the same way a nutrient cation would, effectively taking up some of the available space and increases the chance of the nutrients leaching out of the soil before they can be absorbed by a plant. However, recent studies in this subject have been published that show certain types of clay particles can have a permanent negative charge to their surfaces, and their cation exchange capacity is therefore unaffected by pH. Most of the nutrients found within a soil are in a constant state of recycling rather than being brought in from an outside source. They are taken up by plants, eaten by animals, then put back into the soil either from animal droppings or the remains of dead plants and animals, going through the process of decomposition. Macroorganisms such as millipedes, earthworms, and beetles are the first step in breaking down organic matter. Then, microorganisms such as fungi and bacteria complete the cycle by converting organic forms of nutrients into the inorganic forms that are required by plants. This is one of the most important ecosystem functions that takes place in soils, as decomposition and the subsequent nutrient cycling processes are at the foundations of almost every food web across the planet. Climate has a major influence on the breakdown rate of organic material. Hotter temperatures and higher levels of moisture increases decomposition, so tropical environments will have a much higher rate of nutrient cycling than environments at higher altitudes. But the amount of decomposition that takes place in soils is staggering. Around 90% of the biomass plants produced is returned to the soil as organic matter. This includes the seasonal leaf litter that is dropped by plants, the woody debris of dead trees and shrubs, and the droppings or carcasses produced by animals. The term that encompasses all of this dead organic material is detritus, and the animals that feed on detritus are called detritivores. Detritivores consist of a colorful array of arthropods and vertebrates, and these animals are often the first step in converting organic matter back into its basic nutrient components. Millipedes are a great example of how detritivores start this nutrient cycling process. In a forest environment, millipedes will seek out dead wood or leaf litter to eat, and as they consume it, they shred their food into smaller fragments. They also move organic matter around the forest floor and deeper into the soil as they drop their waste in search of more food. At this point, the detritus has been broken down so finely that decomposing fungi, bacteria, and archaea are now able to begin the final process of nutrient cycling by converting the organic forms of nutrient molecules, such as phosphorus, into the inorganic forms plants need to grow. Let's take a closer look at how plants absorb nutrients. It's a fascinating process that's made easier by the help of fungi and bacteria that live on, in, and around the roots of plants. It's often a two-way symbiotic relationship that benefits both the plant and its accompanying microbes, as well as many more forms of life. This zone is so significant to soil-dwelling organisms that it has its own name, the rhizosphere. The rhizosphere is where plant roots meet soil particles. This zone has much more microbes in it than soil that doesn't have any living roots, because of all the life-sustaining processes that take place in soil directly around plants. Almost all plants have a symbiotic relationship with fungi and bacteria. Plants will excrete sugars and other carbohydrates out of their roots to feed the microbes that are attached to them, and in return, the microbes provide the plant with the nutrients they extract from decomposing the organic matter that's in the soil. And they also act as an extension of the plant's roots that can reach water that would otherwise be too far away from the plant. This special relationship is called a mycorrhiza. Sometimes, mycorrhiza can be so important to the plant or fungi that one or both become totally dependent on the other. One example of this is with orchids. In order for their seeds to open, they must first come in contact with a specific phylum of fungi. Otherwise, their seeds will run out of energy and die before they get the chance to germinate. Microorganisms as a whole are mostly found in the upper horizons of soils. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. There can be a lot of detritus that accumulates on the soil's surface, and as it gets broken down by detritivores, it creates areas where there's a lot of food for microorganisms. The amount of microbes in these areas only lasts as long as there is organic matter that can be decomposed, so the abundance of microbes in a given area is only temporary. Because of this, the distribution of microorganisms is very patchy spatially and temporally, and create what are called hot spots and hot moments of microbial activity. The way in which plants make energy is called primary production. They absorb sunlight at their leaves and use that energy to make sugars that fuel other processes, such as creating new structures or sustaining their metabolism. This is an incredibly important process for both below ground and above ground food webs. Often over half of the products of primary production are put into below ground root systems, and this is what enhances the soil's microbial activity around plants. As mentioned earlier, plants bring sugars and other carbohydrates they made using solar energy down into soils to sustain the mycorrhizal community that surrounds their roots. As this community grows, other organisms, such as nematodes, amoebas, and mites, enter the rhizosphere to feed on the abundant amount of fungi and bacteria. As they do so, they affect nutrient cycling and soil structure processes. These soil organisms, or soil fauna, are a very diverse group that can be classified as microfauna, mesofauna, and macrofauna based on their size, and each of them have their own unique soil functions and roles in below-ground food webs. Microfauna consists of very small, animal-like organisms such as amoebas, flagellates, and ciliates that play a large role in controlling fungi and bacteria populations and affects the rates of nutrient cycling. Mesofauna are larger in size and include nematodes, tardigrades, and small arthropods such as springtails and mites. They feed on microfauna, fungi, or bacteria, in some cases on all of them, and leave behind wastes that are rich in nutrients in both plant available forms and unavailable forms. They are also large enough and strong enough to move the soil around, which creates pore spaces that water and air can move through. Macrofauna are the largest organisms, and consists of earthworms, spiders, and larger arthropods such as millipedes and termites. These organisms are certainly large enough to move soil around, and in doing so, they mix upper layers and lower layers together, which brings organic matter deeper into the soil. They also produce nutrient-rich wastes that plants and other organisms can use. However, the most dramatic effect that macrofauna can have on soils can be seen in ants and termites. They're called ecosystem engineers, and they get this name from their ability to totally change the functionality of a soil in the form of an anthill or termite mound. They concentrate organic material into one location so they can feed the vast numbers of their colonies, and in doing so, also change the dynamics of how other organisms interact with the environment, such as an anteater that has evolved traits around taking advantage of this massive store of food. All of these different types of soil fauna have their own place in the below-ground food web, which is oftentimes much more complex than above-ground food webs. This is because of the incredible diversity of organisms that can be found within soils. Over 25% of the entire planet's biodiversity lives within the soil, and over 40% of terrestrial organisms interact with soils at some point in their lifetime. Below-ground food webs can have many more levels to them, and many of the organisms at every level can feed on multiple levels below them. This is very different than most above-ground food webs. Let's take a look at an example of each and see how they compare. A mountain lion's main source of food is primarily deer, which is an herbivore and can only eat leaves and berries. And yes, mountain lions also prey on other animals like rabbits, but they are also herbivores, so the same rules apply. Let's leave them out of this example. This is a typical food web, with primary producers at the bottom, primary consumers in the middle, and secondary consumers at the top. If the number of deer ever decreases, then the mountain lion's numbers will also decrease because their main source of food is less abundant. There's no way around this for the mountain lion. They can't skip eating the deer and eat the plants directly because their digestive systems can't process the plant material. This results in a food web that is finely tuned and can easily be disrupted. Now let's take a look at a below-ground food web. The first thing that's different is what's at the lowest level. Below-ground food webs most often start with dead organic matter, and the next level up is a decomposer, such as a fungi or bacteria. In this example, the bacteria is eaten by an amoeba, that is then eaten by a nematode, that is eaten by a mite. But if the amoeba numbers are reduced for some reason, many nematodes can also eat bacteria or even fungi. This kind of feeding strategy is common among soil organisms and creates a food web that is robust and adaptive. Below-ground food webs are also incredibly important for above-ground food webs. Many species of insects spend their larval stage underground feeding on dead plant or animal material as they grow. And once they reach their adult stage and leave the soil, they become a part of an above-ground food web and are often a crucial part of them. Amphibians, mammals, birds, reptiles, and even insects all contain species that rely on insects as a part of their diet. This ability to bring soil-derived nutrients into above-ground ecosystems is a remarkable service that soils facilitate and should be preserved at all costs. However, the ways that humans use soil often comes at the detriment of other species. We rely on soil functionality just as much as any other organism would, but we are often short-sighted in our use of it. When we grow crops, we tend to harvest the entire plant and don't put any detritus back into the soil, which is why we need to add fertilizers to our nutrient-poor farmlands. We encounter the same problems with our forest soils when we harvest trees for building structures. And the cities that we build cover large areas of land that effectively eliminates all of the ecosystem functionalities of the soil underneath our roads and buildings. As I said at the beginning of this video, the study of soils is still a relatively new branch of science, and what we are learning today is beginning to change the ways we use soil to meet our needs. With the growing popularity of using cover crops on agricultural land and establishing sustainable forestry practices, humanity is slowly moving in the right direction when it comes to preserving the ground beneath our feet. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something.